Welcome, everyone. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and leave your like so you don't fall asleep without supporting this content, and so YouTube delivers more videos like this to you. You are about to enter a calm and fascinating journey about one of the most intriguing figures who may have ever existed, presented in a light, fluid way, perfect to accompany your night, your rest, or that moment when you just want to relax while learning something truly interesting. This video was created to transform curiosity into mental peace. Here, you will discover little-known details about one of the most fascinating and influential warriors in history, facts about daily life, cultural secrets, and key moments that shaped the Viking world. Everything narrated in a calm, measured, hypnotic, and informative way, so you can absorb knowledge even with your eyes closed. Because learning can be simple, pleasurable, and quietly transformative. So take a deep breath, settle in, and let's begin our journey through the story of Ragnar, the Viking. Chapter 1. The name that echoes through time. Ragnar Lothbrok. Even the name carries weight, mystery, and power. The Viking Age stretched from approximately 793 to 1066, a period when Scandinavian seafarers transformed European history through exploration, trade, and conquest. Within this era, few names resonate as deeply as Ragnar. But here's what makes his story so compelling. We cannot be entirely certain he existed as one single person. Historical records from the 9th century are fragmented, written decades or centuries after events occurred, often by Christian monks who had their own perspectives on the pagan raiders. The primary sources mentioning Ragnar include the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, Frankish annals, and later Icelandic sagas written in the 12th and 13th centuries. These sagas, particularly the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok and the tale of Ragnar's sons, blend history with legend so seamlessly that separating fact from fiction becomes nearly impossible. What we do know is this. Multiple Viking leaders named Ragnar or variations of that name raided across Europe during the 9th century. The historical figure or figures who inspired the legendary Ragnar likely lived between approximately 800 and 865. The name Ragnar itself comes from Old Norse, combining Regan meaning gods or ruling powers, and Arr meaning warrior or army. Lothbrok, his famous epithet, translates to hairy breeches or shaggy pants, supposedly earned from wearing fur trousers during a battle against a serpent. Already, we see the blending of practical detail with mythical embellishment. What matters most is not whether every detail of Ragnar's life can be verified, but understanding what life was actually like for a Viking chieftain in 9th century Scandinavia, and how such a figure could have risen to legendary status. Let's explore that world together, calmly, one detail at a time. Chapter 2. The World Ragnar Knew. Imagine Scandinavia in the early 9th century. The landscape was harsh but beautiful. Dense forests of pine and birch, fjords cutting deep into mountainous coastlines, long winters where darkness dominated, and brief summers when the sun barely set. Most people lived in small farming communities, settlements of perhaps 50 to 200 people. Houses were built from wood and turf, long rectangular structures with central hearth providing warmth and light. Families slept on raised platforms along the walls, wrapped in furs and woolen blankets. The diet was simple but sustaining. Barley porridge, dried fish, preserved meat, cheese, butter, and bread made from rye or oats. Ale was a common drink, brewed by women using barley and herbs. Mead, made from fermented honey, was reserved for special occasions. Daily life revolved around survival and preparation. Men hunted, fished, farmed, and crafted tools. Women managed households, preserved food, wove textiles, and raised children. Children worked from an early age, learning the skills they would need to survive. But Scandinavia was not isolated. By Ragnar's time, Vikings had already been raiding and trading across Europe for decades. They traveled to England, Ireland, Francia, the Baltic, and even as far as Constantinople and Baghdad. They brought back silver, exotic goods, slaves, and stories. This created a unique culture, simultaneously agricultural and martial, isolated yet globally connected, deeply traditional yet rapidly changing. Viking society was stratified into three main classes: thralls who were slaves, carls who were free farmers and craftsmen, and jarls who were nobles and chieftains. A man like Ragnar would have been a jarl, possibly even a petty king ruling over a small territory in what is now Denmark or Sweden. His wealth would come from several sources: agricultural production from land he controlled, tribute from lesser chieftains, plunder from raids, and trade networks stretching across known world. Power in Viking society was not simply inherited. It had to be earned and maintained through success in battle, generosity to followers, wise counsel, and sometimes sheer ruthlessness. A chieftain's reputation was everything. This brings us to a crucial point: the concept of fame in Viking culture. Vikings believed in a form of immortality through reputation. The Old Norse word ordstyrer. Fame after death was considered the highest achievement. Physical death was inevitable, but names spoken with respect across generations meant one's spirit lived on. This is why the sagas were so important, why stories were told and retold, why deeds were exaggerated and embellished. If Ragnar existed, his actions would have been remembered, discussed, expanded, and ultimately transformed into legend precisely because Viking culture valued that transformation. Understanding this helps us approach Ragnar's story not as simple history or pure fiction, but as something more complex, a cultural memory that reveals truth about Viking values, aspirations, and worldview. Now, let's look at what we know about his possible origins. Chapter 3, The Possible Beginnings. If Ragnar Lothbrok was a real historical figure, where did he come from? The sagas tell us he was born into nobility, possibly the son of a Swedish king named Sigurd. According to these stories, Sigurd won a great battle at Bravalla, one of the largest conflicts in legendary Scandinavian history, and united parts of Sweden and Denmark under his rule. Archaeological evidence confirms that Denmark and southern Sweden were indeed unified under powerful rulers during the 8th and 9th centuries. The Jelling dynasty, which would eventually produce Harald Bluetooth, had precursors in this earlier period. If Ragnar's father was indeed a king, Ragnar would have grown up in a royal hall, a large timber structure serving as both residence and political center. These halls were impressive by 9th century standards, the largest to be 30 meters long and 15 meters wide, with carved wooden pillars, tapestries depicting heroic deeds, and a high seat where the king sat to receive visitors and dispense justice. As a king's son, young Ragnar would have received specialized training. He would have learned combat skills with sword, spear, axe, and shield. Viking martial training emphasized practical effectiveness over formal technique. How to fight in shield walls, how to board ships during sea battles, how to lead men in chaotic combat. He would also have learned seafaring, perhaps the most important Viking skill, navigation by sun, stars, and landmark recognition, reading weather patterns, understanding winds and currents, maintaining and repairing ships. These were essential knowledge for any Viking leader. Beyond physical skills, Ragnar would have been educated in law, tradition, and social navigation. Viking law was complex, based on regional assemblies called things where free men gathered to settle disputes, make decisions, and proclaim new regulations. A leader needed to understand legal precedents, negotiation tactics, and how to build political alliances. He would have learned poetry and storytelling, skills highly valued in Viking culture. The ability to compose and recite poetry was not just entertainment. It was a form of political communication, historical record, and spiritual practice. According to the sagas, Ragnar distinguished himself early through boldness and success. One famous story describes how he killed a serpent or dragon that had been terrorizing the land, wearing leather trousers boiled in pitch to protect himself from its venom. This earned him the name Lothbrok. Whether or not the specific event happened, the story reveals something important. Viking leaders were expected to demonstrate courage against seemingly impossible odds, to protect their people from threats, and to do so in memorable ways. What likely happened is that a young Viking chieftain named Ragnar performed some impressive feat, perhaps killing a particularly dangerous animal, perhaps defeating a rival in combat, perhaps surviving a shipwreck or battle that killed others, and this achievement was gradually mythologized into the dragon story. This pattern of historical kernel plus legendary embellishment appears throughout Ragnar's story. As Ragnar matured and proved himself, he would have gathered a war band, a group of warriors personally loyal to him. These relationships were crucial in Viking society. A chieftain provided his warriors with food, shelter, gifts, and opportunity for glory and wealth through raiding. In return, the warriors fought for him, supported his political ambitions, and spread his reputation. The bond between chieftain and warrior was formalized through oaths, often sworn on sacred arm rings kept in temples or at the chieftain's high seat. Breaking such an oath was considered deeply shameful, a violation that could follow a man beyond death. With a loyal war band, resources from his family's lands, and a growing reputation, Ragnar would have been ready to embark on the raids that would define his legacy. But before we explore those campaigns, let's pause and consider something important. What motivated Vikings to raid in the first place? Chapter 4. Why Vikings raided. The Viking Age began not with planned invasion, but with an opportunistic raid. In 793, Vikings attacked a monastery at Lindisfarne, off the coast of northern England. The event shocked Christian Europe. How could pagans desecrate such a holy place? But from a Viking perspective, monasteries were ideal targets. Wealthy, poorly defended, often located near coastlines for easy ship access, and filled with precious objects. Gold and silver religious items could be melted down or traded. Manuscripts, while not valued by Vikings for their content, often had jewel covers. Monks and nuns could be captured and sold as slaves or ransomed back to their communities. To understand Viking raiding, we must understand several interconnected factors. First, Scandinavian geography encouraged seafaring. With limited farmland, long coastlines, and excellent timber for shipbuilding, maritime activity was natural. Second, technological innovation made long-distance raiding possible. The development of the longship, shallow-drafted, ocean-worthy, fast, and capable of sailing up rivers, gave Vikings unprecedented mobility. Third, political fragmentation in Europe created opportunities. The Carolingian Empire was declining. England was divided into small kingdoms. Ireland consisted of competing clans, and local defenses were often inadequate. Fourth, Scandinavian culture valued martial prowess and wealth acquisition as paths to social advancement. A poor farmer's son could join a raid, distinguish himself in battle, gain wealth, and eventually become a respected warrior or even a chieftain. Viking society was more socially mobile than many contemporaneous cultures. Fifth, population pressure in Scandinavia may have pushed younger sons, who would not inherit family lands, to seek fortunes elsewhere. But there was also something deeper, a worldview that saw the world as a place to explore, exploit, and conquer. Vikings did not believe in the way Christians did. They had concept of honor and shame, a behavior fitting or unfitting for free men, but not the same moral framework that made Christian Europeans see raiding as inherently evil. To a Viking, taking wealth from those too weak to defend it was simply how the world worked. This is not to say Vikings were mindless barbarians. They were pragmatic, intelligent, and often sophisticated in their strategies. They engaged in diplomacy when useful, made treaties they honor when advantageous to do so, traded peacefully in many contexts, and even settled in foreign lands and adapted to local customs. But they were also willing to use violence efficiently and without mercy when it served their interests. Ragnar, as a chieftain during the height of the Viking Age, would have embodied this complex combination of warrior, trader, diplomat, and opportunist. Let's now examine the raids attributed to him, separating what we can reasonably believe from what is clearly legendary. Chapter 5. The raids begin. The historical record becomes somewhat clearer when we examine specific raids mentioned in contemporary sources. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records a Viking attack on Northumbria in 841. The Frankish Annals of St. Bertin describe a massive raid on the Seine River in 845, where Vikings sacked multiple towns and extracted 7,000 pounds of silver from Charles the Bald to leave Paris. Later sagas attribute both these raids to Ragnar, though contemporary sources do not explicitly name him. What we can reasonably conclude is that a prominent Viking leader conducted successful raids in both England and Francia during this period, and this leader may have been the historical basis for Ragnar Lothbrok. Let's imagine what such a raid would have actually involved. Preparation began months in advance. Ships had to be readied, crews assembled, provisions gathered, and alliances negotiated with other chieftains. A major expedition might involve a fleet of 10 to 50 ships, each carrying 30 to 60 warriors. That means anywhere from 300 to 3,000 men, a massive logistical undertaking. The journey itself was dangerous. North Sea crossings could take days in good weather, longer in bad. Ships could be lost to storms, navigation errors, or attacks by rival Vikings. But Vikings were master sailors. They understood their ships intimately, knew how to distribute weight, when to row and when to sail, how to beach quickly for raids and launch just as fast when enemies approached. Upon reaching enemy territory, speed and surprise were essential. Viking preferred dawn or early morning attacks, when defenders were unprepared. They would strike coastal settlements, monasteries, or poorly defended towns, seize whatever wealth they could carry, capture slaves, and withdraw before organized resistance arrived. If opposition materialized, Vikings fought with coordinated ferocity. The shield wall, warriors standing shoulder to shoulder with overlapping shields, was their primary formation, creating a mobile defensive barrier from which they could thrust spears and axes. Individual combat skill mattered, but discipline and coordination were equally important. What set Ragnar apart, according to the sagas, was a strategic boldness. The most famous raid attributed to him is the attack on Paris in 845. Paris was not yet the great city it would become, but it was strategically important, sitting on an island in the Seine where bridges connected the north and south banks. According to Frankish sources, Vikings sailed up the Seine with over 100 ships. They sacked towns along the river, accumulating wealth and spreading terror. When they reached Paris, they attacked on Easter Sunday, a deliberate choice that maximized the psychological impact. The defenders were overwhelmed. Vikings plundered the city and surrounding areas. Charles the Bald, king of West Francia, was forced to pay 7,000 pounds of silver in exchange for the Vikings' withdrawal. This established a pattern that would continue for decades. Danegeld, protection money paid to Vikings to prevent raids. From the Viking perspective, this was brilliant strategy. Why risk lives in prolonged combat when you could be paid enormous sums to simply leave? The sagas describe Ragnar's cunning in this raid, how he used tactics and psychological warfare to achieve objectives with minimal Viking casualties. Whether or not the historical Ragnar led the specific raid, the events demonstrate the sophistication of Viking military and political strategy. But success brought consequences that would shape the rest of Ragnar's story. Chapter 6. The Way to Fame. Success in raiding brought wealth, but it also brought complications. A chieftain who returned with ships full of silver and slaves would see his reputation soar. Warriors would flock to join his warband. Other chieftains would seek alliances. His political power would increase dramatically. But wealth also created obligations. Viking culture operated on a gift economy among the elite. A successful chieftain was expected to be generous, distributing wealth to followers, hosting feasts, giving rings and weapons to loyal warriors. The more wealth you accumulated, the more you were expected to give away. This created a perpetual cycle. Raid for wealth, distribute wealth to maintain loyalty, need more wealth, conduct more raids. Additionally, success attracted rivals. Other Viking chieftains might see a rising leader as a threat. Established kings might fear he was becoming too powerful. Local enemies he had defeated might seek revenge when he was away on expeditions. According to the sagas, Ragnar dealt with these pressures through continued bold action. When his reputation in Francia was established, he supposedly turned his attention to England, conducting raids in Northumbria and East Anglia. The political situation in England during this period was complex. The island was divided into multiple kingdoms: Northumbria in the north, Mercia in the Midlands, East Anglia in the east, Wessex in the south, along with several smaller territories. These kingdoms were often at war with each other, which created opportunities for Viking exploitation. Vikings could play kingdoms against each other, offer mercenary services to one side while raiding the other, or simply attack whoever seemed weakest at any given moment. But there was another dimension to Ragnar's life that the sagas emphasize: his relationships and family. Viking family structures were complex, and marriage among the elite was as much political alliance as personal relationship. The sagas describe Ragnar as having multiple wives and many sons, each of whom become famous in their own right. His first marriage, according to legend, was the Lagertha, a shield maiden, a woman who fought as a warrior. The existence of female Viking warriors is debated among historians. A famous burial at Berka in Sweden contained a body with full warrior equipment, including weapons, armor, and horses, which was later confirmed through DNA analysis to be biologically female. This proves at least some women held warrior status in Viking society, though whether they fought regularly in battles remains uncertain. The Lagertha story, whether historical or legendary, tells us something important about Viking attitudes toward women and power. While Viking society was certainly patriarchal, women could own property, initiate divorce, manage households, and occasionally wield significant political influence. Later, Ragnar supposedly married Thora, daughter of a Swedish jarl, and after her death, a Slog, who claimed descent from the legendary heroes Sigurd and the Valkyrie Brynhild. From these marriages came sons who would become some of the most famous Vikings in history: Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside Hvitserk, Sigurd Snake in the Eye, and Ubba. Whether these were all sons of one historical Ragnar, or whether the sagas combined multiple generations and different families into a single narrative is unclear. What matters is understanding the importance of lineage in Viking culture. A chieftain's legacy lived through his descendants. Sons were expected to equal or surpass their father's achievements. Family reputation could span generations, with each member adding to or diminishing the family's standing. This brings us to the final act of Ragnar's story, the event that transformed him from successful raider into enduring legend. Chapter 7. The Fateful Voyage. According to the sagas, Ragnar's downfall came from hubris and fate intertwining. After years of successful raids, Ragnar supposedly became convinced of his own invincibility. The gods favored him, or so it seemed. His luck had held through countless battles and storms. He decided to raid England again, but this time with only 2 ships. To prove his prowess required no great fleet. His sons and advisors warned against this. The strategy was unsound. 2 ships meant fewer than 100 warriors, insufficient for a major raid, yet enough to attract serious retaliation. But Ragnar insisted. In Viking culture, a man's courage and reputation sometimes demanded actions that practical wisdom would counsel against. The journey was cursed from the start. Storms battered the ships. One was lost completely. The other, damaged and leaking, limped to the Northumbrian coast. Ragnar and his surviving warriors landed in the territory of King Aella of Northumbria. Aella was a historical figure, though our knowledge of him is limited. He ruled Northumbria from approximately 860 to 867, a period of intense conflict between Vikings and Anglo-Saxons. According to the sagas, Ragnar's diminished force was quickly surrounded. They fought fiercely, as Vikings always did, but were overwhelmed by numbers. Ragnar was captured alive. Now comes the most famous part of the legend, the event that ensured Ragnar's story would never be forgotten: his execution by being thrown into a pit of venomous snakes. Contemporary Anglo-Saxon sources do not mention the specific execution method, which is suspiciously similar to legendary deaths in other sagas. However, they do confirm that a significant Viking leader was captured and executed in Northumbria around 865, and that this execution triggered massive retaliation. The saga describes Ragnar facing death with defiant poetry, composing his death song as snakes bit him repeatedly, recounting his glorious deeds and predicting vengeance by his sons. The final line of this death song is echoed to the centuries: how the piglets would grunt if they knew what the old boar suffers. The piglets being his sons, who he predicted would avenge him terribly. Whether or not Ragnar died exactly this way, what followed is undeniable historical fact. The Great Heathen Army. Chapter 8. The Great Heathen Army. In 865, 1 year after the reported death of Ragnar, the largest Viking invasion force ever assembled descended on England. This is documented in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, Frankish sources, and later medieval histories. It was not a raiding party, but a conquering army, with thousands of warriors, horses, equipment for prolonged campaigning, and clear strategic objectives. The leaders are named in historical sources: Ivar, Halfdan, and Ubba, identified as brothers and as sons of Ragnar. Whether they were literally Ragnar's sons, or whether they claimed that lineage to justify their invasion is debatable, but the connection was clearly important to them, and to how their contemporaries understood the campaign. The great heathen army landed in East Anglia, then moved north to Northumbria. Their stated purpose was clear: revenge for Ragnar's death. In 867, they captured York, the capital of Northumbria. King Aella and his rival Osbert, who had been fighting each other for control of the kingdom, united to face the Vikings but were defeated. According to Viking sources, Aella was captured and executed by the Blood Eagle, a horrific ritual execution where the victim's ribs were severed from the spine and spread like wings. Modern historians debate whether the Blood Eagle was a real practice or a later literary invention. No contemporary sources describe it, only later sagas. But the fact that Vikings claimed to have performed this ritual execution is significant. Whether they actually did it or only said they did, the message was clear. Ragnar's death had been avenged in the most brutal way possible. The great heathen army then proceeded to conquer most of England over the next decade. They defeated East Anglia, Mercia, and most of Northumbria, establishing Viking control over what would become known as the Danelaw, the region where Scandinavian law and customs predominated. Only Wessex, under King Alfred, managed to resist and eventually push back against Viking expansion. This massive historical event, the conquest and permanent settlement of much of England by Vikings, was directly attributed by medieval sources to revenge for Ragnar Lothbrok's death. Whether that revenge motivation was the actual cause or convenient justification for an invasion that had economic and political motivations matters less than this fact. Ragnar's story, whether he existed exactly as described or not, had real historical consequences. His sons use his name and his death as a rallying point for one of the most significant military campaigns of the 9th century. This is the power of narrative in Viking culture. Stories did not just reflect reality. They shape reality. A legend could inspire armies, justify conquests, and transform political landscape of Europe. Chapter 9. Separating Man from Myth. So, who was the real Ragnar Lothbrok? Let's consider what we can state with reasonable confidence, based on historical evidence. First, one or more Viking chieftains named Ragnar conducted significant raids on England and Francia during the mid-9th century, particularly around 845. Second, these raids were remarkably successful, demonstrating both military skill and strategic thinking, including the extraction of Danegeld from Frankish rulers. Third, a Viking leader was captured and executed in Northumbria around 865, and this execution was used as justification for the great heathen army's invasion. Fourth, the sons of this leader, whether named Ivar, Bjorn, and Ubba or operating under those names, led the conquest of much of England between 865 and 878. Fifth, by the 12th century, when the major sagas were written, these various historical figures and events have been consolidated into the narrative of Ragnar Lothbrok, his deeds, his death, and his son's revenge. The consolidation process involved combining stories from different sources, adding legendary elements like dragon slaying and the Blood Eagle, emphasizing themes important to Viking culture like courage, fate, reputation, and family loyalty. Why does this matter? Why spend so much time distinguishing history from legend? Because Ragnar's story, in all its complexity, reveals something profound about how human beings create meaning through narrative. The Vikings who told and retold Ragnar's story were not trying to deceive anyone. They were doing something more important. They were preserving and transmitting cultural values through memorable characters and events. Ragnar represented the ideal Viking chieftain. Brave, cunning, successful, generous, a skilled warrior, a wise leader, a man whose reputation would live forever. Whether every detail was factually accurate mattered less than whether the story conveyed truth about what Vikings valued and aspired to. Modern historians sometimes criticize medieval sources for this blending of fact and legend, but perhaps we should recognize it as a different form of knowledge, not scientific history, but cultural memory. Ragnar existed, if not exactly as described, then as an archetype, a crystallization of Viking Age ideals into a single compelling narrative. And that existence had real power, real consequences, real historical impact. His story inspired the great heathen army. It motivated warriors for generations. It shaped how Vikings understood themselves and how others understood Vikings. In that sense, Ragnar is profoundly real, regardless of which specific biographical details can be verified. Chapter 10. Life Beyond the Battles. We focus heavily on raids and battles because that's what the sources emphasize. But let's take a moment to consider what Ragnar's daily life might have been like between these dramatic events. Most of his time would have been spent managing his domain. As a jarl or petty king, Ragnar would have presided over legal disputes at local thing assemblies, decided land allocation issues, mediated conflicts between followers, received tribute from subordinate chieftains, and planned agricultural activities. Viking chieftains were not just military leaders but administrators, judges, and economic managers. He would have maintained relationships with other powerful figures through gift-giving, feasting, marriages, and personal visits. A chieftain's hall was the center of political life. Large feasts were common, serving both social and political functions. Alliances were forged, deals negotiated, reputations enhanced or damaged, all over shared meals and drinking. These feasts could last for days, with massive quantities of meat, bread, and ale consumed. Poetry would be recited, stories told. Sometimes debates or arguments would break out, occasionally resulting in violence if insults went too far. Managing a war band was a constant responsibility. Warriors needed to be trained, equipped, kept satisfied with gifts and opportunities for glory, and occasionally disciplined when they overstepped boundaries. A chieftain who lost the loyalty of his warriors would quickly find himself vulnerable. Ragnar would also have participated in religious practices, though our knowledge of pre-Christian Scandinavian religion is fragmentary. Vikings worshipped gods like Odin, Thor, and Freyr, held seasonal festivals, made sacrifices at sacred sites, and believed in a complex cosmology of 9 worlds connected by the world tree Yggdrasil. For a warrior like Ragnar, Odin would have been particularly important. Odin was a god of war, wisdom, and poetry, who welcomed fallen warriors to Valhalla, his hall where they would feast and fight until Ragnarok, the end of the world. The concept of dying in battle as the best death stems from this religious framework. A warrior who died in his bed would go to hell, a neutral afterlife, while one who died with weapon in hand would be taken by Odin's Valkyries to Valhalla. This belief system encouraged the boldness and fearlessness Vikings were famous for. Death in battle was not just honorable, it was literally a gateway to paradise. Ragnar would have made offerings to the gods before major raids, seeking their favor. He might have consulted seers or vulvas, female practitioners of seed, a form of Norse magic focused on prophecy and fate. Family life would have occupied considerable attention as well. According to the sagas, Ragnar had multiple sons and daughters. Raising and preparing these children, arranging marriages, deciding which sons would inherit which portions of wealth and territory. These were crucial decisions that would determine his legacy. Viking fathers were expected to teach sons practical skills, combat training, political wisdom, and cultural traditions. The relationship between Ragnar and sons like Ivar and Bjorn, as depicted in sagas, shows affection but also high expectations. Sons were meant to equal or surpass their father's achievements. Between all these responsibilities, managing territory, maintaining alliances, leading warriors, participating in religious rites, raising children, Ragnar's life would have been full, complex, and demanding even when he wasn't on raids. The image of Vikings as simply violent raiders is incomplete. They were also farmers, traders, craftsmen, poets, and political operators navigating a sophisticated social system. Ragnar would have embodied all these roles, not just the warrior aspect emphasized in dramatic retellings. Chapter 11. The Viking Worldview. To truly understand Ragnar, we need to understand the Viking worldview that shaped how he and his contemporaries interpreted their experiences. Vikings saw the world through the lens of fate, or WRD in Old Norse. Fate was not quite determinism, as we might understand it. Vikings believed certain major events were predetermined by the Norns, 3 female beings who wove the threads of destiny. But how one faced those fated events was a matter of choice and character. A man could not change whether he would die young or old, but he could control whether he faced death with courage or cowardice, whether his reputation would be honorable or shameful. This created a paradoxical worldview, fatalistic about outcomes, yet intensely focused on agency and choice in how one lived. Courage was a supreme virtue, because it was a thing you could control regardless of fate. Even if doom was certain, you could meet it bravely, This explains Vikings' famous fearlessness in battle. It wasn't that they didn't fear death, but that they believed facing death bravely was more important than survival. Honor and reputation, or drengskap, meant living according to the codes of proper warrior conduct. Being brave, keeping oaths, defending family and followers, being generous to friends and terrible to enemies, facing challenges directly rather than through deception or cowardice. But Vikings also value cleverness and cunning, particularly as embodied by Odin, who was a trickster god as well as a war god. There was no contradiction in Viking thought between being honorably brave and also being strategically cunning. Ragnar's reputation for both courage and clever tactics fit perfectly within this framework. Family loyalty was paramount. Blood feuds could span generations. If your kinsman was killed, you had an obligation to seek vengeance or exact compensation. Failure to do so brought shame. This explains the emphasis on Ragnar's sons avenging his death. Whether or not they were literally his biological sons, the cultural script demanded that they seek revenge, and claiming kinship with a killed man legitimized their campaign. Vikings also believed strongly in reciprocity and gift exchange. Gifts created obligations. If a chieftain gave you a valuable ring, you owed him loyalty. If you gave someone a feast, they were expected to reciprocate or support you in other ways. This created complex webs of mutual obligation that held Viking society together despite the absence of strong centralized authority. Another key concept was hamingja, a kind of personal luck or spiritual power that some individuals possess more strongly than others. A person with strong hamingja would succeed in their endeavors. Their crops would grow well. Their ships would survive storms. Their warriors would win battles. Ragnar would have been perceived as having exceptionally strong hamingja, evidenced by continued success. His eventual capture and death would have been understood as his hamingja finally running out, perhaps because fate had decided his time was over, or perhaps because he had offended the gods through hubris. Vikings also believed in the importance of proper death. How you died mattered enormously. A warrior's death in battle was ideal. A death from old age in bed was acceptable, but less glorious. Death from disease, especially diseases that cause visible suffering or disfigurement, was shameful. This is why the snake pit death, if it happened, would have been considered particularly tragic. It wasn't death in honorable combat, but execution, dying helplessly, unable to fight back effectively. Yet the saga portrays Ragnar maintaining his dignity through poetry and defiance, thus salvaging honor from what could have been a shameful end. Understanding these cultural values helps us see that the Ragnar story isn't just about one man's exploits, but about Viking civilization's deepest beliefs about how life should be lived and death should be faced. Political operators navigating a sophisticated social system. Ragnar would have embodied all these roles, not just the warrior aspect emphasized in dramatic retellings. Chapter 12. Ragnar's Legacy in Viking Expansion. Ragnar's story, whether historically accurate in every detail or not, became a catalyst for one of the most significant movements in medieval history, Viking expansion and settlement beyond Scandinavia. The generation after Ragnar saw Vikings transform from raiders to settlers and rulers. We've discussed the great heathen army's conquest of England, but that was only one front. During the same period, Vikings were establishing settlements in Ireland, founding cities like Dublin. They were exploring and colonizing Iceland, which had no previous human population. They were settling the Faroe Islands and beginning to reach toward Greenland. Francia, Vikings were establishing permanent settlements along river valleys, particularly in what would become Normandy. In Russia, Swedish Vikings known as Rus were creating trade networks and political entities that would eventually evolve into the Russian state. This expansion wasn't simply military conquest. It involved trade, exploration, cultural exchange, intermarriage, religious conversion, and political integration. Within 2 or 3 generations of Ragnar's time, Vikings would convert to Christianity, adopt local languages and customs, and become integrated into European civilization while still maintaining distinctive characteristics. Ragnar's descendants, both literal and claimed, played crucial roles in these developments. His son Bjorn Ironside, according to sagas, raided throughout the Mediterranean, possibly reaching as far as North Africa and Italy. Whether or not the specific Bjorn was Ragnar's son, Viking raids did reach the Mediterranean during this period, showing the extraordinary reach of Norse seafaring. His son Ivar, called the Boneless, became king of Dublin and ruled over a sea kingdom spanning the Irish Sea, connecting Viking settlements in Ireland, the Isle of Man, and northern England. Again, whether this Ivar was Ragnar's biological son is uncertain, but rulers claiming descent from Ragnar held power across wide territories. Ragnar's grandson, or a ruler claiming to be such, named Rollo, negotiated the Treaty of St. Clair-sur-Epte in 911, receiving a large territory in northern Francia in exchange for defending against other Vikings and converting to Christianity. This territory became Normandy, named after the Norsemen who settled it. Rollo's descendants included William the Conqueror, who invaded England in 1066, ironically reversing the Viking conquest of England 2 centuries earlier. So the historical impact of the Ragnar legend can be traced through centuries and across continents. His story inspired warriors, justified conquests, legitimized dynasties, and became a founding myth for multiple Viking kingdoms and settlements. Even if the historical Ragnar was just one among many successful Viking chieftains of the 9th century, the legend of Ragnar Lothbrok became a unifying narrative, a cultural touchstone that gave meaning and legitimacy to Viking expansion. This is perhaps the most important point. In history, what people believe happened can be as consequential as what actually happened. The Vikings who claimed descent from Ragnar, the warriors who fought under his name, the rulers who invoked his legacy, they acted based on the story, and those actions shaped the world. In that sense, Ragnar's existence as a historical figure is almost beside the point. Ragnar as a cultural force, as a narrative that inspired action, was undeniably real and undeniably consequential. Chapter 13. Ragnar and Saga Literature. The primary literary sources for Ragnar's story are the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok and the tale of Ragnar's sons, both written in Iceland during the 13th century, approximately 400 years after the events they describe. This time gap is crucial to understanding these texts. They are not eyewitness accounts or contemporary histories. They are medieval literature, drawing on oral traditions, earlier written sources now lost, and the creative imagination of their authors. Icelandic saga writers in the 13th century were looking back at the Viking Age as a heroic past, a time when their ancestors were powerful, independent, and unconquered by Christianity and European civilization. The sagas served multiple functions: entertainment, historical remembrance, moral instruction, and cultural identity formation. They were written in a distinctive style. Sparse prose, understated emotions, focus on action and dialogue, with sudden bursts of poetry at crucial moments. The saga of Ragnar Lothbrok tells his life story from youth through his death, including his marriages, his raids, his relationship with his sons, and his eventual downfall. It emphasizes themes central to Viking values: courage, cunning, fate, family loyalty, and the importance of reputation. The tale of Ragnar's sons continues the story, focusing on how his sons avenge his death through the conquest of England. These sagas are fascinating literary works, but they present challenges for historians trying to extract historical facts. They contain demonstrable anachronisms, mixing events from different time periods. They include supernatural elements like prophetic dreams, encounters with mythical creatures, and divine interventions. They sometimes contradict contemporary sources, or each other. Yet they also contain details that align with what we know from archaeology and contemporary documents: descriptions of ships, weapons, social structures, legal practices, and daily life that match physical evidence. Modern scholars take a nuanced approach, treating the sagas as valuable sources that must be used critically, cross-referenced with other evidence, and understood in their medieval literary context. What the sagas give us, perhaps more than accurate biography, is insight into how Vikings understood themselves and their world. They show us what Vikings valued, what they feared, how they made sense of success and failure, how they thought about fate and free will, family and honor, life and death. In that sense, whether the specific events happen exactly as described is less important than understanding that the sagas reflect Viking cultural truths. Ragnar, as presented in the sagas, is less a historical figure than an ideal type, a character who embodies a Viking worldview so perfectly that his story became the template through which Vikings understood their own experiences. Chapter 14. Archaeological Insights. While written sources are fragmentary and problematic, Archaeology has provided invaluable insights into Viking Age life that help us contextualize Ragnar's story. Ship burials have revealed the sophistication of Viking seafaring technology. The Oseberg ship, discovered in Norway, dates to approximately 834, right in Ragnar's period. It's beautifully crafted, over 20 meters long, with intricate carvings. It was buried with a high-status woman, along with servants, animals, and grave goods including a cart, sleds, textiles, and everyday items. This and other ship burials show that the ships described in sagas were real, functional, and also works of art. The Gokstad ship, also from Norway, dates to around 900. It's a bit later than Ragnar's time, but shows similar construction techniques. Modern replicas of this ship have successfully sailed across the Atlantic, proving Vikings had the technology to reach North America, as sagas claim, and as the settlement at Lance Aux Meadows in Newfoundland confirms. These ships had shallow drafts, allowing them to sail up rivers far inland. They were fast, maneuverable, and could be beached easily for quick raids or repairs. Understanding Viking ships helps us appreciate the military and logistical achievements attributed to Ragnar. His raids deep into Francia, sailing up the Seine to Paris, were technologically feasible. Weapon finds, including swords, axes, spears, and armor, show that Viking warriors were well equipped. The best swords were pattern welded, combining different types of iron and steel to create blades that were both flexible and hard, able to take a sharp edge without breaking. These weapons were valuable, often given names, passed down through families, and buried with their owners. A chieftain like Ragnar would have possessed multiple high-quality weapons, some for actual use, others as status symbols and gifts for followers. Fortress excavations, particularly the ring fortresses in Denmark like Trelleborg and Firket, show that Vikings built sophisticated military installations during the late 9th and 10th centuries. These were not crude wooden palisades, but precisely geometrical structures with carefully planned layouts, built to house large numbers of warriors and control strategic territories. While these particular fortresses postdate Ragnar, they demonstrate that Viking military organization was more advanced than simple raiding bands. Settlement archaeology in places like York and Dublin shows how Vikings adapted to urban life when they transitioned from raiders to rulers. York, or Jorvik as Vikings called it, became a major Viking city after its conquest in 867. Excavations show Viking houses, workshops, markets, and clear evidence of both Norse and Anglo-Saxon populations living together, trading, and gradually merging culturally. This reminds us that the Viking Age wasn't just about conflict. It was also about cultural exchange, economic development, and the creation of new hybrid societies. Ragnar lived in the raiding phase, but his sons and grandsons would become urban rulers, administrators, and eventually Christian kings barely distinguishable from their European counterparts. Burial practices revealed through archaeology also illuminate Viking beliefs about death and the afterlife. High-status individuals were buried with goods they would need in the next life: weapons, jewelry, tools, food, animals, sometimes even ships. Slave sacrifices sometimes accompanied such burials, a practice that shocks modern sensibilities but was part of Viking religious beliefs. If Ragnar was buried at all, and his death in captivity makes a proper burial uncertain, it would likely have been a simple affair, nothing like the elaborate ship burials reserved for those who died at home with time to prepare. Yet his son's success would have been understood partly as him honoring his memory through their achievements, a form of posthumous burial in glory rather than in the ground. Chapter 15. Ragnar's Christianity Problem. One crucial aspect of Ragnar's story involves his relationship with Christianity, or more precisely, his existence at a pivotal moment in Scandinavian religious history. During Ragnar's lifetime, Scandinavia was still pagan, worshipping the old Norse gods. But Christianity was expanding northward, brought by missionaries, traders, and conquered populations. Vikings raiding Christian territories encountered Christianity constantly. They captured Christian slaves who practiced their religion. They negotiated with Christian kings. They sometimes faced Christian resistance justified in religious terms as defense of Christendom against pagans. Some Vikings converted, either genuinely or pragmatically. Conversion could open trade opportunities, facilitate diplomatic relations, or provide advantages when settling in Christian territories. Others remained staunchly pagan, seeing Christianity as a foreign religion that undermined traditional values. Ragnar, as portrayed in sagas, was pagan throughout his life, died before the major wave of Scandinavian Christianization began in the late 9th and 10th centuries. But this creates an interesting historical tension. The sagas about Ragnar were written by Christian Icelanders in the 13th century, centuries after Iceland had converted to Christianity around year 1000. These Christian authors were writing about pagan ancestors. How did they handle this? Sometimes they portrayed pagan figures sympathetically, emphasizing their honor, courage, and other virtues that aligned with Christian ideals even if their religion differed. Other times they included subtle or explicit criticisms, suggesting pagan beliefs led to tragic mistakes or moral failures. With Ragnar, the saga writers seem to have taken the first approach. They present him as admirable despite his paganism, focusing on his warrior virtues rather than his religious beliefs. This reflects broader medieval Christian attitudes toward pre-Christian ancestors. They were seen as noble people who unfortunately lived before Christ's truth reached them, but whose moral qualities were still praiseworthy. From a historical perspective, Ragnar's paganism helps explain some aspect of Viking raiding. Pagan Vikings had no religious inhibitions about attacking Christian monasteries. To them, these were simply wealthy, poorly defended targets. The Christian horror at desecrating holy sites meant nothing to people who didn't share those religious beliefs. Moreover, Viking paganism, with its emphasis on fate, courage, and reputation rather than moral righteousness or salvation, created a different ethical framework. A Christian might wrestle with whether raiding was sinful. A Viking would simply consider whether it was strategically wise and whether it would enhance or diminish his reputation. This is not to say Vikings were amoral. They had strong ethical codes around loyalty, honor, and appropriate conduct. But these codes were based on social relationships and reputation rather than divine commandments about right and wrong. Ragnar's world was one where gods were powerful but capricious, where fate could not be avoided but could be faced bravely, where death was certain but reputation could be eternal. Christianity would eventually replace this worldview in Scandinavia, but in Ragnar's time, the old gods still held sway. His story represents the pagan Viking Age at its height, before the cultural transformation that would integrate Scandinavia into Christian Europe. Chapter 16. Psychology of a Viking Leader. What was it like to be Ragnar? What motivated him? What were his fears, hopes, and inner experiences? Obviously, we can't know this definitively. We have no personal writings, no diary entries, no introspective passages in contemporary sources. But we can make educated inferences based on what we know about Viking culture, leadership demands, and human psychology. First, consider the pressure of reputation. In a culture where fame was literally considered a form of immortality, maintaining and building reputation would have been a constant concern. Every decision Ragnar made would have been evaluated not just on practical outcomes, but on how it would affect his standing. Would this action be seen as bold or reckless, wise or cowardly, generous or stingy? This would create intense psychological pressure, but also a kind of clarity. There was a script for how a great chieftain should behave, and following that script brought social rewards. Second, consider the burden of leadership. Ragnar was responsible not just for himself, but for hundreds of followers whose lives depended on his decisions. A failed raid didn't just mean personal setback. It meant warriors dead, families without providers, loss of political support, rivals emboldened. The weight of command in a society where leaders led from the front, fought alongside their men, and were held directly accountable for outcomes would have been enormous. Third, consider the reality of violence. Modern people, even military personnel, typically experience violence episodically and often with psychological trauma afterward. Vikings live with violence as a constant possibility. They trained for it from childhood, engaged in it regularly, witnessed it frequently. This doesn't mean they were psychologically unaffected, but they would have processed violent experiences differently, within a cultural framework that valorized martial prowess and provided meaning to combat through concepts like honor, fate, and Valhalla. Ragnar would have killed many people in battle. He would have seen friends and family members killed. He would have made decisions that resulted in deaths, both of enemies and occasionally his own people. How did this affect him psychologically? We can't know, but Viking culture provided coping mechanisms. Rituals, poetry, community validation, religious explanations. Fourth, consider ambition and mortality. Viking men of Ragnar's era typically lived into their 40s or 50s if they survived childhood and warfare. Many died younger. This created urgency. You didn't have decades to gradually build reputation. You needed to act decisively while young and physically capable. Ragnar's supposed final raid, undertaken when he was older and arguably should have been more cautious, reflects this tension between wisdom and the need to maintain reputation even as age diminishes physical capacity. Fifth, consider family dynamics. Having multiple sons by different marriages would have created complex emotional and political situations. Each son would have ambitions and expectations. Ragnar would have to balance supporting all of them while also managing potential rivalries and jealousies. The relationship between father and sons in Viking culture was affectionate but also competitive. Sons were expected to eventually equal or surpass fathers, which created both pride and subtle tension. Finally, consider the existential dimension. Vikings believed in an apocalyptic end of the world, Ragnarok, when gods and men would fight in a final battle and the world would be destroyed and reborn. They believed in fate, but also in the importance of choice within fate. They faced death constantly, but believed that how you died and how you were remembered afterward mattered more than simple survival. This worldview would have created a kind of fatalistic courage. If your death was already determined, then anxiety about death was pointless. Better to face it boldly and ensure your reputation lived on. Ragnar, standing in a pit of snakes according to legend, composing poetry about his glorious deeds rather than begging for mercy, represents the ultimate expression of the psychology. Whether or not that specific scene happened, it captures something true about the Viking mindset. Defiance of death, pride in accomplishments, confidence that reputation would outlive the body. Chapter 17. Women in Ragnar's World. We focus primarily on Ragnar and male warriors, but Viking society included women as active participants, not just passive background figures. The sagas mention multiple women in Ragnar's life, most famously Lager, the shield maiden, and Aslog, the wise queen. How much of these specific stories is historical is uncertain, but they reflect real aspects of women's roles in Viking society. Viking women had more rights and independence than women in many contemporary European societies. They could own property in their own names, not just through husbands or fathers. They could initiate divorce if husbands were absent too long, if husbands failed to provide, or if they were abused. They could inherit property under certain circumstances. They managed households, which in agricultural societies meant managing significant economic enterprises. Some women engaged in trade, traveling to markets and negotiating deals. Poetry and saga evidence suggest some women practiced seed or Norse magic and divination, gaining influence through perceived supernatural abilities. The question of female warriors is more controversial. The Burka warrior burial proves at least some women were buried with full warrior honors and equipment. Whether this means they fought regularly in battles or held warrior status for other reasons is debated. Saga literature includes multiple shield maidens, suggesting the concept was at least imaginable and perhaps occasionally real within Viking culture. Contemporary foreign sources occasionally mention female Viking fighters, though it's unclear if these were regular participants or exceptional cases that attracted attention precisely because they were unusual. What we can say is that Viking society recognized female capability for violence and leadership in ways that many medieval societies did not. If Lagertha existed, she would have been exceptional but not completely outside the realm of possibility. More common than warrior women would have been women who wielded power through other means. As wives of chieftains, women managed estates while husbands were raiding, handled diplomatic correspondence, arranged marriages for children, and sometimes made political decisions. As widows, especially of powerful men, women could control significant wealth and political influence. As mothers, women shaped the next generation of leaders, transmitting cultural values, family histories, and social connections. Aslog, as portrayed in sagas, represents this type of powerful woman. She is not described as a warrior, but as wise, strategic, capable of prophecy, and influential in her son's upbringing and decisions. Whether or not Ragnar had a wife exactly like a slog, it's plausible that a chieftain's wife would have played significant roles in family politics and in shaping her son's ambitions. The emphasis on Ragnar's sons avenging him might have been partly driven by their mother, encouraging them to claim their inheritance and avenge their father's death, both for emotional reasons and for strategic political purposes. Women also participated in Viking expansion as settlers, not just as warriors or wives of warriors. When Vikings transitioned from raiding to settlement in places like Iceland, Ireland, and England, women came as colonists, bringing livestock, household goods, and skills needed to establish new communities. Archaeological evidence from Viking settlements shows women's artifacts and work areas alongside men's, indicating women were integral to the settlement process. In Ragnar's specific story, women appear mainly in traditional roles: wives, mothers, occasional shield maidens. But it's worth remembering that behind those saga characters were real women whose labor, decisions, and actions were essential to Viking society's functioning. Chapter 18. The Practical Realities of Viking Raiding. Imaging 1. Busy atmospheric shot of Viking harbor with multiple longships being loaded with supplies, warriors organizing equipment, blacksmiths working, organized chaos of preparation, photorealistic, documentary photography style. Imaging 2. Cinematic close-up of navigation tools on ship deck, sun compass, rope, maps on weatherwood, ocean visible in background, practical maritime details, photorealistic textures, golden hour lighting. Imaging 3. Dramatic overhead shot of Viking War Council, leaders gathered around rough map on table, weapons laid aside, torchlight, serious planning session, photorealistic, strategic military planning atmosphere. Imaging 4. Atmospheric shot of Viking warriors dividing plunder, piles of silver coins and treasures, chieftain distributing shares, fairness and order in distribution, photorealistic, critical post-raid moment. Chapter 19. The End of an Era. Ragnar's story, whether we locate him precisely in history or see him as a composite figure, represents a particular moment in Viking Age history, the height of the raiding period before Vikings transitioned to settlers and rulers. By the late 9th century, patterns were shifting. The great heathen army that supposedly avenged Ragnar established permanent settlements in England rather than just raiding and withdrawing. Viking leaders began taking Christian names and integrating into European aristocracy. They started building fortresses and administering territories rather than just extracting wealth through raids. Trade became as important as plunder. Vikings established towns like York and Dublin as commercial centers, connecting Scandinavian, European, and Islamic trade networks. Political structures became more centralized. Kings in Scandinavia began consolidating power, reducing the independence of local chieftains and jarls. Christianity gradually spread through Scandinavia, changing cultural values and integrating the region into European Christendom. Within a century of Ragnar's death, the Viking Age as he would have known it was essentially over. His sons and grandsons were Christian kings, speaking local languages, following local laws, building churches instead of temples to Odin. The longships still sailed, but increasingly for trade and communication rather than raids. The transition wasn't sudden or complete. Raiding continued sporadically. Pagan beliefs persisted in some regions for generations. Viking identity remained strong even among Christianized descendants. But the world was changing fundamentally. Ragnar represents the last generation of pure Viking Age culture, before the integration with European civilization that would eventually make Vikings indistinguishable from other medieval Europeans. This is perhaps why his story became so important. He was remembered as the archetypal Viking from the heroic age, before Christianity, before settlement, when Vikings were independent raiders whose primary loyalty was to reputation, family, and followers rather than a Christian god or feudal lord. Later generations of partially Christianized, partially Europeanized descendants look back at Ragnar as a symbol of their pagan Viking past. The sagas about Ragnar, written centuries after his death, reflect this nostalgia for a disappeared world. They preserve values that were fading. The old honor codes, the belief in fate and Valhalla, the emphasis on reputation and glory, the acceptance of violence as legitimate means to achieve goals. By the 13th century, when the sagas were written down, Vikings had been Christian for 200 years. The military prowess that had made them feared had been absorbed into European feudalism. The ships that had been instruments of terror were now commercial vessels. But the stories remained, allowing people to remember when their ancestors were raiders who bent the will of kings, who sailed wherever they pleased, who lived by their own laws and died facing their fate with poetry on their lips. Ragnar embodies this memory. He is what Vikings were before they became something else. Understanding his story requires recognizing it as both history and elegy, both biography and cultural preservation, both fact and deliberately constructed myth. Chapter 20. The Viking Legacy in Modern Imagination. Ragnar's story didn't end with the sagas. His name and legend have been rediscovered and reinterpreted in each era since, taking on new meanings and resonances. During the Romantic period of the 19th century, Vikings became symbols of Nordic racial superiority, warrior masculinity, and resistance to Christianity and civilization. This interpretation was deeply problematic, eventually feeding into Nazi ideologies that grossly distorted historical Vikings to serve racist and nationalist agendas. Modern historians have worked hard to correct these distortions, showing that Vikings were more ethnically diverse, more culturally sophisticated, and less uniformly violent than romantic and fascist interpretations suggested. In late 20th and early 21st centuries, Vikings have been reimagined again through popular culture. Television series like Vikings have brought Ragnar to mass audiences, blending historical details with dramatic fiction, creating a version of Ragnar that resonates with contemporary values while still evoking the historical period. These modern retellings tend to emphasize certain aspects: family loyalty, individual agency against fate, cultural clash between paganism and Christianity, strong female characters, moral complexity rather than simple heroism. This reflects our contemporary interests and values as much as any historical reality. But in doing so, modern retellings participate in the same process that created the original sagas, taking historical fragments and shaping them into narratives that speak to current concerns and aspirations. Ragnar has become a kind of canvas onto which each generation projects its own ideas about heroism, masculinity, freedom, honor, and cultural identity. For medieval Icelanders, he represented the pagan Viking past they were distancing themselves from while still honoring. For 19th century Romantics, he symbolized primitive vitality and racial heritage. For modern audiences, he might represent questioning authority, living authentically, valuing family and loyalty, or navigating moral complexity in a changing world. What's remarkable is the endurance of the name and the basic story framework across more than 1,000 years. Ragnar Lothbrok, whether he existed exactly as described or not, has achieved the immortality that Vikings believed was the highest human achievement. His name is still spoken, his deeds still remembered, his story still retold. In that sense, regardless of historical specifics, Ragnar succeeded in his culture's ultimate goal. He lives in memory, in reputation, in the continued telling of his tale. This is what Vikings meant by fame after death. Not literal physical immortality or heaven in Christian sense, but the immortality of being remembered, discussed, and honored across centuries. By that measure, Ragnar Lothbrok is one of the most successful Vikings who ever lived. What Ragnar teaches us. As we reach the end of this exploration, what can we take away from Ragnar's story? First, the complexity of historical truth. Ragnar's story reminds us that history is not simply what happened, but what was recorded, remembered, retold, and eventually written down, often decades or centuries after events. This doesn't mean we can't know anything about the past, but it means historical knowledge is always partial, interpreted, and constructed from fragmentary evidence. The fascinating thing about Ragnar is that his historical ambiguity doesn't diminish his significance. If anything, it makes his story richer, showing us how human beings create meaning through narrative, how legends serve cultural functions, and how stories can have real historical consequences regardless of their factual accuracy. Second, the power of cultural values to shape behavior. Vikings believed certain things about courage, fate, reputation, honor, and family. These beliefs weren't just abstract ideas. They motivated specific actions, shaped political decisions, influenced military strategy, and ultimately transformed European history. Ragnar's story, whether fully historical or partially legendary, embodies these values so perfectly that understanding his story gives U.S. insight into Viking culture as a whole. Third, the importance of context in understanding historical figures. We cannot judge Ragnar or Vikings generally by modern ethical standards without understanding their worldview, their circumstances, and their cultural framework. This doesn't mean excusing violence or conquest, but means recognizing that 9th century Scandinavian raiders operated within a different reality than we do, with different assumptions about what was normal, acceptable, and honorable. Fourth, the enduring human themes that make historical stories resonate across centuries. Ragnar's story touches on timeless concerns, ambition and its consequences, family loyalty, facing mortality with dignity, building a legacy, navigating between wisdom and boldness, the tension between fate and free will. These themes speak to people across wildly different cultures and time periods because they address fundamental human experiences. Fifth, the complexity of the Viking Age itself. Vikings were not simply violent raiders, but farmers, traders, explorers, poets, craftsmen, and eventually settlers who transformed Europe not just through conquest, but through cultural exchange. Ragnar's era was a pivotal moment when Scandinavia was transitioning from isolated pagan societies to integrated participants in medieval European civilization. His story captures that moment of transition, representing both the old ways that were passing and the changes that were coming. Finally, the reminder that learning history can be a form of mental rest and expansion simultaneously. You've spent these hours exploring a distant time, understanding different worldviews, following threads of a complex story that spans fact and legend. In doing so, you've given your mind a journey away from immediate concerns, into another world where different rules applied and different values held sway. This is what makes history valuable, not just academically but personally. It expands our sense of what human life can be, how differently people can organize societies and understand existence. Ragnar Lothbrok, Viking chieftain, legendary hero, cultural symbol, has accompanied us on this journey. Whether he existed exactly as the sagas describe, whether he was one man or several, whether every raid attributed to him actually happened, matters less than what his story reveals about human ambition, cultural values, the power of reputation, and the ways we create meaning through narrative. His name has echoed through more than 1,000 years. It will likely echo through centuries more. And in that echoing, in that continued telling and retelling, Ragnar achieves what he and all Vikings most desired: immortality through fame, life beyond death through the speaking of his name. Thank you for joining this exploration. May your rest be peaceful, your dreams vivid, and your curiosity always lead you toward deeper understanding.